I covered my family's rent, groceries, and car payments for 3 years. The one time I asked for help after surgery, my mom declared, "You're not our responsibility." So I stopped paying. 2 weeks later, they were begging in my driveway. I, 29M, never thought 3 years of sacrifice would end with my own mother telling me I wasn't their responsibility. But when those words left her mouth while I was recovering from surgery, something inside me snapped. What happened next changed everything. For 3 years, I'd been my family's safety net. Mom, Dad, and my younger sister had all fallen on hard times around the same time I landed my first real job out of college. Dad got laid off from the factory, Mom's hours at the diner got cut to almost nothing, and my sister was struggling through community college while working part-time at a grocery store. I stepped up without hesitation. Their rent was $1,200 a month, and I covered it religiously. Groceries ran another $400 to $500 monthly, and I handled that too. Dad's car payments were $280, Mom's were $320, and I took care of both. Between rent, groceries, and car payments alone, I was shelling out over $2,200 every month to keep them afloat. My own studio apartment cost me $800, and I lived off ramen and whatever leftovers I could scrounge. I drove a beat-up Honda with 180,000 miles that I'd bought with cash in college. While they were comfortable, I was barely scraping by, but I told myself it was temporary. Family helps family, right? The arrangement started when Dad lost his job. He came to me looking defeated, explaining they were 2 months behind on rent and facing eviction. Mom was crying in the background, and my sister looked terrified. I didn't hesitate to write the check. Then it became the car payments when they couldn't manage both. Then groceries when Mom's hours got cut even further. What started as emergency help became their expectation. Every month, like clockwork, I'd transfer the money. They never asked anymore after the first few months. They just assumed it would be there. And it always was, even when it meant I couldn't afford to go out with friends or replace my worn-out work clothes. I convinced myself things would change when Dad found work again. But months turned into a year, then 2 years, then 3. Dad did eventually find another job, but it paid less than his previous one. Mom picked up a few more shifts, but they never suggested reducing my contributions. My sister graduated community college but moved back home instead of finding her own place. The surgery happened in March. I'd been having severe abdominal pain for weeks, and it turned out to be appendicitis that had developed complications. What should have been a simple procedure turned into a week in the hospital and another 3 weeks of recovery at home. My short-term disability only covered 60% of my salary, and the medical bills were staggering even with insurance. 2 weeks into my recovery, I called Mom to explain the situation. I told her I was struggling financially with the reduced income and unexpected medical expenses. I explained that I might need to temporarily reduce what I was giving them, or better yet, maybe they could help me out this one time like I'd helped them for 3 years. Her response still echoes in my head. She went quiet for a moment, then said in this cold voice that I wasn't their responsibility. She reminded me that I was an adult who should have had better savings and insurance. She suggested I figure it out on my own like they'd had to do before I started helping. I sat there in stunned silence, phone pressed to my ear, unable to believe what I was hearing. This was the woman I'd kept from being evicted. The woman whose groceries I'd paid for when she couldn't afford to feed her family. The woman whose car I'd kept running when she couldn't make the payments. That's when something fundamental shifted inside me. The fog of obligation and guilt that had kept me sending money for 3 years suddenly cleared. I realized they hadn't seen my help as temporary assistance between family members. They'd seen it as their due. They'd gotten comfortable with my money solving their problems, and now they viewed me as nothing more than a reliable income stream. I told Mom I understood her position perfectly and hung up. Then I did something I should have done months, maybe years earlier. I opened my banking app and canceled all the automatic transfers I'd set up for their rent, car payments, and grocery allowance. Every single recurring payment stopped immediately. I didn't call to warn them. I didn't send an explanation text. They made it clear I wasn't their responsibility, so I decided they weren't mine either. The first week passed quietly. I figured they probably had enough money on hand to cover their immediate expenses, or maybe they assumed I'd sent them money manually instead of through the automatic transfers. I used that week to rest and recover, and for the first time in years, I didn't stress about whether I'd have enough money left over after supporting them. By the second week, reality started hitting them. Dad called first, asking if there was some kind of problem with the bank transfers. I told him there was no problem. I'd simply stopped sending money. He sputtered and demanded an explanation, so I reminded him of Mom's exact words about me not being their responsibility. I explained that I'd taken her advice to heart and decided the arrangement worked both ways. He tried to argue, claiming they'd never said they wouldn't help me in an emergency. But I'd recorded that conversation with Mom on my phone, and when I played back her words about me not being their responsibility and needing to figure things out on my own like an adult, he went quiet. Mom called later that day, her tone completely different from our last conversation. She tried to downplay what she'd said, claiming I'd misunderstood her meaning. She insisted she'd only meant that I should have been more prepared financially, not that they wouldn't help family. But the recording didn't lie, and neither did my memory of the cold dismissal in her voice. My sister called that evening, panicking about their rent being due in 3 days. She begged me to reconsider, promising they'd all contribute to help with my medical bills if I just kept the money flowing. But promises from people who'd had 3 years to contribute and never once offered weren't worth much to me anymore. By the end of the second week, the situation had reached a crisis point for them. They'd gotten eviction notices, the car payments were overdue, and they'd been surviving on whatever food was already in the house. That's when all 3 of them showed up in my driveway. I watched from my window as they got out of Mom's car, the one I'd been paying for. Dad looked angry, Mom looked desperate, and my sister just looked scared. They stood there for almost 10 minutes before finally approaching my door, and I could hear them arguing among themselves about what to say. When I opened the door, the begging started immediately. Mom was crying, apologizing for what she'd said, and insisting she'd been having a bad day and didn't mean it. Dad was trying to be authoritative, demanding I stop this childish behavior and resume my responsibilities to the family. My sister was just pleading, asking how I could let them lose everything over one misunderstanding. I listened to all of it calmly, then asked them a simple question. If our situations were reversed, if they had been supporting me for 3 years and I told them they weren't my responsibility when they needed help, would they have continued paying my bills? The silence stretched on uncomfortably. Dad's anger deflated, Mom's tears stopped, and my sister couldn't meet my eyes. They all knew the answer, and they all knew I was right. But I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone and showed them a spreadsheet I'd created during my recovery. Over 3 years, I'd paid them $79,200 in rent, groceries, and car payments. That didn't include the emergency money I'd given them for utilities, repairs, medical bills, and other unexpected expenses, which brought the total to over $85,000. I explained how I'd lived in a studio apartment while paying for their 3-bedroom house, how I'd eaten ramen while buying their groceries, how I'd driven a car held together with hope while making their car payments. I'd sacrificed my own comfort and financial security for 3 years, and the one time I'd needed help, they'd abandoned me completely. Dad tried to interrupt, claiming they'd never asked me to sacrifice so much. But I reminded him of all the times they'd called with emergencies, all the times they'd hinted about money troubles, all the times they'd made me feel guilty for having a good job while they struggled. They might not have explicitly demanded the money, but they'd certainly made sure I felt obligated to provide it. Mom attempted a different approach, insisting they were still family and family should help each other. I agreed completely, which seemed to give her hope until I pointed out that her definition of family help seemed to only flow in one direction. For 3 years, I'd been the only one helping. The moment the flow needed to reverse, I'd suddenly stopped being their responsibility. My sister made one last desperate plea, pointing out that they'd lose everything if I didn't resume the payments. I acknowledged that was probably true, then asked her why that was my problem to solve. She'd had 3 years to save money, get a better job, or find her own place. Instead, she'd gotten comfortable living off my generosity and made no effort to become independent. The conversation ended with them leaving empty-handed, but I wasn't finished with the situation. Over the next few days, I did something I probably should have done years earlier. I started making calls to understand their real financial situation. Update 1. What I discovered during those phone calls completely changed my perspective on the entire 3 years. I'd assumed my family was genuinely struggling and barely surviving without my help. The reality was far different and infinitely more infuriating. I started by calling my cousin, who worked at the bank where my parents had their accounts. While he couldn't give me specific details due to privacy rules, He could confirm whether they'd been depositing my monthly transfers and what they'd been doing with the money. What he told me made my blood boil. My parents had been depositing my money and using it exactly as intended for about the first year. But for the last 2 years, they'd been using my contributions to supplement their lifestyle rather than replace their income. Dad's new job actually paid almost as much as his old one when you factored in the overtime he'd been working. Mom had been picking up catering gigs that paid cash under the table, money they never reported or mentioned to me. Between Dad's job, Mom's official diner wages, her unreported catering income, and my monthly $2,200, they'd actually been living quite comfortably. While I'd been eating ramen and driving a dying car, they'd been going out to dinner twice a week and taking weekend trips to visit Mom's sister in another state. The car payment revelation was even worse. I'd been making payments on cars they'd bought brand new right after I started helping them. They'd deliberately chosen expensive models with high monthly payments because they knew I'd be covering the cost. Dad's truck had leather seats and a premium sound system. Mom's SUV had every available upgrade package. But the discovery that sent me over the edge was learning about my sister's situation. She hadn't just moved back home after community college. She'd never actually moved out. The whole time I'd been supporting them, she'd been living rent-free while working and going to school. She'd saved up enough money to buy a car and put a down payment on her own place, but she'd chosen to stay home and keep the money instead. I confronted them with this information during a tense phone call with my parents. Dad tried to justify it by claiming they'd never lied to me, just hadn't volunteered information about their improving situation. Mom insisted they'd thought I was happy to help and didn't want to burden me with the decision of whether to continue. But their justifications fell apart when I pointed out that they'd let me struggle financially while they lived comfortably off my generosity. They'd watch me drive a car that broke down regularly while making payments on their luxury vehicles. They'd seen me lose weight from eating cheap food while they dined out on my dime. The phone call ended with Dad yelling that I was being ungrateful and Mom crying that I was destroying the family. I hung up and blocked both their numbers. My sister tried a different approach, showing up at my apartment a few days later. She attempted to appeal to our sibling relationship, insisting that Mom and Dad's mistakes shouldn't affect our bond. But when I asked her directly whether she'd known about their true financial situation, her silence gave me the answer. She'd known. She'd watched me sacrifice for 3 years while knowing her parents were using my money to fund their lifestyle choices. She'd saved thousands of dollars by living rent-free while I struggled, and she'd never once suggested I reduce my contributions or mentioned that her parents were doing better than they'd led me to believe. Update 2. 3 weeks after I'd stopped the payments, the consequences started cascading for my family. The eviction notice became an actual eviction proceeding when they couldn't come up with the rent money. Both cars were repossessed within days of each other when they missed the payments I'd been making. Without reliable transportation, Dad started missing work, which put his job in jeopardy. My sister finally moved out, but only because she had no choice once the eviction went through. She rented a small apartment and tried one more time to convince me to help, but I'd moved past the point of caring about their problems. She'd had 3 years to prepare for independence and had chosen to coast on my generosity instead. During this time, I started receiving calls from extended family members who'd been fed a very different version of events. According to my parents, I'd cruelly abandoned them after they'd fallen on hard times, cutting off support with no warning and refusing to help family in need. They'd painted themselves as victims and me as a selfish son who'd forgotten where he came from. I started sending the recording of Mom's conversation to relatives who called to lecture me. The responses were immediate and dramatic. Aunt Sarah called back within an hour to apologize for believing my parents' version of events. Uncle Mike, who'd been particularly harsh in his criticism, left a voicemail expressing his shock at hearing how they'd actually treated me. But the most satisfying response came from my grandmother, Mom's own mother. After hearing the recording, she called my parents directly and apparently delivered a scathing lecture about ingratitude and taking advantage of family. According to my cousin, Grandma had been so disgusted that she decided to reduce my parents' Christmas and birthday gifts going forward. The financial pressure on my parents intensified when they realized none of their siblings or relatives were willing to step in and replace my contributions. Everyone in the family had assumed they were barely surviving and that I was helping out of necessity. Learning that they'd been living comfortably while manipulating me eliminated any sympathy they might have received. Meanwhile, my own financial situation began improving dramatically. Without the monthly drain of supporting my family, I had an extra $2,200 in my budget. I used some of it to pay down my medical debt faster and started building an emergency fund for the first time in 3 years. I even bought myself new work clothes and got my car properly serviced. The psychological relief was even more significant than the financial benefits. For 3 years, I'd carried constant stress about money and worry about my family's well-being. Now I slept better, ate better, and stopped dreading the monthly ritual of transferring money I couldn't afford to give. My parents made one final attempt to reconcile during week 4. They showed up at my workplace, hoping to catch me off guard and appeal to my emotions in a public setting. But having them appear at my job only reinforced my decision. They were so desperate to restore their financial pipeline that they'd risk embarrassing me professionally. I spoke with them briefly in the parking lot, and they offered what they thought was a compromise. They'd acknowledged that they'd been wrong and apologized sincerely if I'd resume payments at a reduced amount. Even 60% of what I'd been paying would help them manage their situation better. I declined immediately. Their offer wasn't about making amends or repairing our relationship. It was about negotiating a better deal for financial support. They still saw me as a source of money first and a son second. The apology was just a means to an end, not genuine remorse for how they'd treated me. Update 3. 6 months later, I received an unexpected call from my sister. Her tone was different from our previous conversations, less desperate and more reflective. She told me that she wanted to apologize, not because she wanted anything from me, but because she'd had time to truly understand what had happened. Living independently had given her perspective on what I'd sacrificed for 3 years. She was struggling to afford her own rent, groceries, and car payment on her salary, which made her realize how much I'd been covering for the entire family. She'd also learned more about our parents' actual financial situation during that time and felt ashamed of her role in enabling their deception. Her apologies seemed genuine, but I wasn't ready to rebuild that relationship yet. Too much trust had been broken, and I needed to see consistent change over time rather than words of regret. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but needed space to process everything that had happened. My parents' situation had stabilized somewhat, but at a much lower standard of living than they'd enjoyed on my dime. Dad was working longer hours at his job and had picked up a weekend side gig. Mom had taken on more catering work and was working at the diner nearly full-time. They'd moved into a smaller, cheaper apartment and were driving used cars they'd bought with cash. Essentially, they were living the way they should have been living all along, within their actual means rather than on my subsidy. The lifestyle they'd maintained while I supported them had been artificially inflated and unsustainable without my contributions. The most telling indicator of their true priorities came through my cousin, who mentioned that my parents had been complaining to anyone who'd listen about having to work so much harder now. They weren't lamenting the loss of relationship with their son. They were bitter about losing their comfortable lifestyle and having to support themselves like regular adults. I realized then that my decision to cut them off hadn't just been about self-respect or financial protection. I'd been enabling their avoidance of responsibility and preventing them from developing the independence they needed as adults. My 3 years of generosity had actually harmed them by making them dependent on someone else's income instead of building their own financial stability. The experience taught me valuable lessons about boundaries, manipulation, and the difference between helping family and enabling them. Real help empowers people to improve their situation and become independent. What I'd been doing was creating dependence and resentment while sacrificing my own well-being in the process. Today, I'm financially stable for the first time in years. I've built up a solid emergency fund, improved my living situation, and started investing for my future. Most importantly, I've learned to recognize when help becomes enablement and when generosity becomes exploitation. I don't hate my family, but I don't trust them either. They showed me who they really were when they thought I needed them, and I believe them. If they ever want a relationship with me again, it will have to be built on mutual respect and genuine change, not financial desperation or manipulation. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are really just comfortable using you. The hardest lesson I learned was that family obligations shouldn't flow in only one direction, and that being related to someone doesn't give them the right to take advantage of your kindness indefinitely. The 2 weeks they spent begging in my driveway taught me that respect and gratitude can't be bought. They have to be earned through consistent actions and genuine care for each other's well-being. My family failed that test when I needed them most, and their financial desperation afterward only proved they'd valued my money more than our relationship all along.